Good evening, everyone. My name is Sanjeev Anand, and as Dean of the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan, I want to welcome you to the 2013 John Stack Memorial Lecture. This lecture was established through a generous donation from the McKercher Law Firm to honor John Stack. Mr. Stack was an extremely successful lawyer with what is now McKercher LLP. His principal area of practice was business law, and he spent much of his time drafting complicated leases, sales agreements, etc. However, he has been described as a lawyer's lawyer. His depth of intellect, soundness of character, as well as being a person possessing a deep religious conviction, and above all, a desire to help his fellow man and woman, made him a true leader in his profession and community. In creating this lecture series, Mr. Stack's partners and law firm wanted to bring to the university persons of similar intellect and generosity of spirit as the man for whom the lecture series is named. And I think we have been successful in the past at doing that. This year's speaker certainly fits the bill. Previous lectures were delivered by such notable individuals as Brian Dixon, former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, internationally renowned legal theorist Ronald Dworkin, and Peter Lougheed, the former Premier of Alberta, to name but a few. This lecture series, the College of Law and the University of Saskatchewan are extremely fortunate to have the support of high-profile members of the legal profession, the judiciary, and government, many of whom are present tonight. I am also gratified to see a number of university colleagues from the College of Arts and Science here this evening. This year's lecture will be delivered by a giant in the world of Canadian federal politics. Preston Manning was a Canadian Member of Parliament from 1993 to 2002, leader of the Reform Party of Canada from 1987 to 2000, and leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition from 1997 to 2000. Mr. Manning is known for his expertise on issues of ethics in politics and of faith in the public sphere. Hence the topic of his lecture tonight, Politics, Ethics, and Faith. In 2007, Mr. Manning was made a Companion of the Order of Canada, an honor befitting an individual who has given so much back to Canada and Canadians through his public life. Since retirement in 2002 from Parliament, Mr. Manning has released a book entitled Think Big, published by McClelland and Stewart, describing his use of the tools and institutions of democracy to change Canada's national agenda. He has also served as a senior fellow of the Canada West Foundation and as a distinguished visitor at the University of Calgary and the University of Toronto. He is a member of the Institute of Corporate Directors and is an Institute-certified corporate director. Currently, Mr. Manning is a senior fellow of the Fraser Institute and president and CEO of the Manning Center for Building Democracy. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Preston Manning.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman and ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, first of all, just want to say thank you for the opportunity to be here and for the invitation to talk with you. As was mentioned, the subject tonight is politics and ethics and faith. And from what I understand about John Stack, I understand he had interests and capabilities in all of these areas, and I just hope that this lecture would do justice to his memory. I'd like to start with just a little history, personal history and political history. We have this Center for Building Democracy based in Calgary, where what we're trying to do is raise the knowledge and skill, strengthen the knowledge and skills, ethical foundations, leadership, communications capacity of political participants. And we do a fair amount of training there, but I always start with a little bit of history, and then particularly younger people say, well, why do you always do that? So I tell them this Olympic story. There used to be an event in the Olympics called the standing broad jump. how far could you jump from standing still? I think the record was 3 meters and something, about 9 feet, which is quite a jump. But there's also, of course, that event has been discontinued, but there's the running broad jump, where the record is about 9 meters, or 28 feet. And the lesson out of all this is that you can leap forward further if you can get a run at it than if you do it from standing still. And I like to start with a little bit of history, because your politics didn't start on the day that we became interested or we became involved. There's a long history to it that we ought to know. Just from our own family standpoint, as some of you will know, my dad was raised on a homestead here in Saskatchewan in the Rosetown area. He was one of 3 brothers. The family in the 20s and 30s, which were fairly tough times here, they could only afford to send the one son to university, and the convention then was to send the oldest son. So his brother, Bill, studied at this university, got an education degree, became a teacher. Was a high school counselor here in Saskatoon for many years, and an alderman. My father and his younger brother had an interest in technology in those days, which involved getting a radio. It sounds pretty archaic, I know. They ordered one of those crystal set radios from the Montgomery Ward catalog and got it set up on the roof of their place. And one of the first radio broadcasts he ever heard was William Aberhart from Calgary, who had pioneered really religious broadcasting, radio broadcasting, and political radio broadcasting in the 20s. And my father made a commitment of his life to Christ by listening to this radio preacher. And Aberhart started a school in Calgary for ministers, so my father went over to be a student for the Christian ministry in Calgary. Aberhart ran a soup kitchen in conjunction with this institute of his on the west end of 8th Avenue, which at that time was now getting into the Depression, and the young men that were riding the rails looking for work who would show up at his soup kitchen. They'd jump off the trains to avoid the CPR police, and they'd end up at his soup kitchen. And he started to see, I get all this from my mother, who knew him quite well. He started to see in these soup kitchen lineups young people that he, as a high school principal, had sent off hopefully to be doctors and lawyers, and here they're riding the rails. And I guess it almost drove him crazy. And she says somebody handed him a pamphlet on the social credit idea, which was sort of a poor man's Keynesian economics. If you primed the pump by extending credit, maybe you could get the economic machine going. And Aberhart ended up with this social credit party in Alberta. Aberhart himself didn't want to create a political party. He thought of himself as an educator. But the grassroots ran away with it, and my father ended up then being elected to the legislature in 1935. So he went to Alberta to be a minister of the gospel, ended up a minister of the crown. Some people would regard that as a demotion, but he wasn't. But I want to reflect a little bit on our prairie politics, and this is our, particularly if you're born or your parents were, or you've come to Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Alberta. It's our story, whether we like it or not. It's our story, and I think it's worth rehearsing that the 2 parts of this country that will innovate politically by creating new parties. The 2 regions of the country, of course, are Quebec and the West, particularly the prairies. Quebec has a long list of parties outside the old liberal conservative tradition: the Bloc Populaire, the Union Nationale, the PQ, the BQ, the ADQ, what's the new one, the CAQ, a long stream of third parties. But of course, that's also the story of the West. Louis Riel is the first, the starter of a grassroots political movement in the West. He created Manitoba as a province as a result. I had a Métis friend in Alberta that said Riel was the first reformer, and I should make a bigger thing out of that. But we knew that Louis got hung in the end, and this was not conducive to membership sales. So, but then the next Western movement was the autonomy movement that resulted in the creation of Alberta and Saskatchewan as provinces. And the leader of that was F.W. Haltain, whom our family happens to think was maybe one of the best premiers the West ever produced. He was the last premier of the old Northwest Territories. He should have been the first premier of Alberta or Saskatchewan, but he got on the wrong side of the Liberal, the Laurier government. He ended up being leader of the opposition here in Saskatchewan, ended up being the appointed Chief Justice, I think, by the Borden government, ended up being the Chancellor of this university. But he was a leader of a third party or of a movement outside the traditional process. And then, of course, there was the Progressive Party of Canada. In many respects, one of the most successful third party that the West ever produced. Ended up having the second largest number of seats in the 1921 Parliament. And then, of course, ones that we're more familiar with, the CCF, the Depression parties, the CCF that came to power here in Saskatchewan and Social Credit in Alberta. None of these formed a federal government, although several of them formed provincial governments, but all of them had a significant impact on the national agenda. Agricultural reforms, democratic reforms, the foundations of the welfare state, budget balancing, things like that. And all sought to increase the influence of Western Canada in Confederation. And I think in that regard, it's worth taking time to note that on May 2nd, 2011, the political center of gravity of this country shifted from the old Laurentian region, Ontario and Quebec, working together one way or another, to a new alignment between Ontario and the West. And 145 of Mr. Harper's 166 majority government seats, 145 of those are west of the Ottawa River. This is a seismic shift in the center of gravity, in the center of influence of the country. And although that occurred in the 21st century, I think it's a result of the cumulative efforts of all these movements that have come out of the West. Now, besides innovating through new parties, there's another characteristic of prairie politics that's quite striking. And again, it's part of our political story. It's part of our heritage, whether we like it or not. And that is that 5 of the 6 reform movements to come out of the West had a spiritual or religious dimension to them. I was raised in a political and evangelical home. I never had any difficulty, even though when I went to university, I started out in physics. I had to quit because I couldn't handle the math, and I went into economics, but I always put that in for my physicist friends. But I never had difficulty accepting the basic tenets of the Christian faith. My challenge was, how does it work itself out? How does it apply to science, to business, to conflict resolution, and to politics? I disagreed with a fellow I met in Edmonton who attended a very large church there. And when I asked him why he attended that, he said, because nothing to do there interferes with my business, my politics, or my religion. And my conception of faith is that if it's real and if it's been internalized, it should have an impact on your business and your politics and your faith, hopefully for the good. And if it's not for the good, then I would argue it's probably a misguided faith. So going back to the history of the West, Riel, people forget, yes, Riel wanted to created a new entity in Manitoba, but Riel, towards the end, he had wanted to change the Catholic Church. In fact, by the second Riel Rebellion, he had a lot more to say on religion than he did on politics. The people who formed the Progressive Party of Canada, if you look at the list of names, are almost the same people that helped create the United Church of Canada, the largest Protestant denomination in the country. And then, of course, the CCF, J.S. Woodsworth and Tommy Douglas, both ministers of the gospel, Woodsworth a Methodist, Douglas, I guess, a Baptist, motivated by the social gospel interpretation of Christian faith. And in Alberta, Aberhart and my father, both lay preachers of an evangelical persuasion. Both Tommy Douglas and my father, John Diefenbaker also, were associated with Baptist churches, which I guess illustrates the diversity and independence of Baptist adherents. My father used to use pig-headedness rather than independence, and it reminds me of a story that both Tommy Douglas and my dad used to tell, except they switched it a little bit depending on where they were telling it. And it was the story of the first Baptist church in Kentucky. And this is apparently how it came about. There were 2 families that were pioneering in Kentucky, and they established the first Baptist church in a little schoolhouse, and they used to meet every Sunday. But one Sunday, the subject for discussion was, and this is an ethical question, what do you do if the outlaws are coming to your cabin and you've hidden your wife and your children in the cellar, and the outlaws ask, where's your wife and your children? Do you tell them the truth and risk the lives of your wife and children, or do you lie to save your wife and children? Well, by golly, by the next Sunday, there were 2 Baptist churches in this town, the truthful Baptist and the lying Baptist. And when my dad would tell it in Alberta, he would say, that I'm a truthful Baptist, and Tommy, he would leave that. And when Tommy would tell it, he would say he was the truthful Baptist, and that guy in Alberta, he was the other denomination. And of course, John Dieferbaker, being a criminal lawyer, he was on either side. Once he was on both sides. But returning to our story, in the 1920s and 30s, of course, and there are people here who know this, if not from their own experience, of course, from your parents and grandparents. There were 2 major streams of religious thought that swept across the prairies, a little bit like the North Saskatchewan and the South Saskatchewan River. There was the social gospel people who felt that the primary focus of the Christian faith is on relationships between people. Its primary objective is to reconcile relationships between people, social justice, and believe passionately in that. And ultimately that commitment translated into the political arena, into the creation of the CCF, and many of the people, not all, but many of the people in the CCF. If you took Tommy Douglas's Bible and threw it on the floor here, it would open by virtue of frequent use to the 9th chapter of Luke's Gospel, the story of the Good Samaritan, the man who loved his neighbors himself. On the other hand, there at the same time, and I'm talking mainly about the Protestant side of the house. I understand there's equivalents on the Catholic side. I'm just not as familiar with them, so I'll use the Protestant example. The evangelical, so the social gospel people are going around carrying a crossbar. The horizontal relations. The evangelicals felt that the primary function of the Christian faith was to get a relationship between the individual and God, personal salvation. If you didn't get that right, you couldn't get the rest of it right. If you took Abraham's Bible and threw it on the floor, it would open up to the 3rd chapter of John's Gospel, where Jesus talked to a religious leader about the necessity of an internal transformation. Unless you're born again, you can't serve the kingdom of God. Now, somebody's pointed, and of course that translated in Alberta, a lot of the people that held those convictions ended up in the social credit thing because Abraham was leading that politically. Of course, it's been pointed out since that if you put the 2 dimensions together, you end up with the cross, the great symbol of the Christian faith. And that if one does read the New Testament carefully and looks at the life of Jesus carefully, those 2 dimensions, the right relationships among people and social justice and a right relationship with God are in balance. Now, turning to faith and politics today then, as you will well know, the conventional wisdom is that faith and politics should not be mixed and should be kept in watertight compartments. Certainly there's a taboo in the House of Commons, which is almost ironic because the House of Commons professes to be committed to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and guaranteeing freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience. But there's a taboo in the House that you do not talk about your deepest spiritual convictions, and you do not talk about those of your constituents, except in the most general terms. And personally, I believe in the separation of the institutions of church and state, and that's not what I'm arguing against, but not in the separation of faith from political discussion. And really for 2 reasons, one democratic and one aristocratic. The democratic reason for believing that you can't separate these 2 is if you look at these religion polls that Ipsos Reid does every year. You can do them in your constituency. I did one in my riding of Calgary Southwest. Despite the declining attendance at religious services, which many people measure the health of or the existence of religious sentiment by attendance at churches, 75 to 80% of Canadians profess to believe in God, the number goes up if you say God or a universal spirit. Some 60% profess to believe that God communicates to people through inspired writing, scriptures, whatever the description. And almost 40% profess to pray daily. Well, I know most of my parliamentary colleagues, if I went to them and say 70% of your constituents think the moon is made of green cheese, whether they believed it or not, next week they'd have a speech sort of suggesting maybe we would acknowledge this dimension. The second reason I'd say for advancing this idea that we've got to be more open about talking about faith and politics in the same department is the fact that some of our greatest political leaders have been sustained and informed by faith, and they shouldn't have to hide it. Over 60% of Tommy Douglas's early speeches would be considered politically incorrect today. 90% of Aberhart's, they'd have locked him up if they heard him talking that. And it's not just those older leaders. Some of you may have seen, there's a book called The Hidden Pierre Elliott Trudeau, The Faith Behind the Politics, edited by John English, published in 2004. After Mr. Trudeau's death, there was some additional information that came out that none of his earlier biographers included in their biographies, that Trudeau never gave up on the Catholic teachings that he received at Collège de Brébeuf, that he was particularly interested in a form, it was called the Catholic personalism, and that view informed his work on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, on the dignity of the person. Here's a religious faith, it's affecting a public policy. Some of his closest colleagues, a conference was held to look at this, and some of his closest colleagues expressed amazement of why is it that in all that time he never breathed a word about it. Alan McEachern said to me, like, I considered myself a friend. Mr. Trudeau, I'm a Catholic. Why did we never talk about this? Well, we've got this, you don't talk about that. And of course, particularly coming from Quebec at the time of the Quiet Revolution, if Trudeau had breathed a word of this. Well, I guess what I'm saying is I think it should be, we need to legitimate the expression of faith in the political arena. And I could go on this at great length, but I'll say just two things that I think that people who have faith commitments can do to more legitimate the expression of faith in the political arena. And the first is that people of faith need to renounce any recourse to coercion to advance their position. If you ask the ordinary guy in the street why he's afraid of religion and politics, it's because if those religious people ever get a hold of the legislature or the parliament, they're going to impose their values and their position on me. It's that fear of imposition and coercion, and it's a legitimate fear. If you go back through the history of Christianity, it's not clear of not trying to impose its convictions. So I think renouncing that recourse to coercion, not just the Christian faith, but other faiths as well. Jesus, the one thing you read about in the New Testament, I mean, his opponents attacked him on every conceivable way they could, but the one ground on which they didn't attack him is to say, if you go along with this guy, he's going to ram that Sermon on the Mount down your throat. They never accused him of that because they couldn't. He invited people to follow him. He never tried to coerce anybody into following him. And I think we got to learn that lesson as Christians and representatives of other faith communities as well. The second thing is that I think people of faith need to practice the great guideline that he gave his own followers before he ever let them out to do public work. You know, in the New Testament, like he had a 3-year ministry. During the first year, he did it all, it appears he did it all himself. And these disciples just followed around and watched what he did. They didn't do anything. But there came a day when he sent them out to do public work, to do what he was doing, teaching, helping the poor and whatever, and to do public work in his name. But he gave them this guideline at the front end. He said, be wise as serpents and gracious as doves. And what I say to faith audiences, and I talked to a few of them, he did not say, be vicious as snakes and stupid as pigeons. And when believers of any faith behave like that, they not only turn people off their faith, they say, we don't want that discussion even to occur in the scientific arena, or in a political arena, or in a business arena. Now, one of the ethical dilemmas that, let me come to ethics then, because I want to watch my time and I want to have time for questions, which is usually the fun part of these evenings. When I was in Ottawa and couldn't sleep at night, which was quite frequent, we were there. When we arrived there, the country was headed to $50 billion a year deficits, which worried us to no end. And of course, I got there in '93, and the Quebec secession crisis was coming to head. I used to worry myself sick about secession. I've studied secession since 1965, and the federal states had come apart. That, for one thing, it's a disgrace to the people that were running the country at that time. How did you let it happen? And there's very few secession crises that have occurred without violence. But anyway, when I couldn't sleep, I would read the Canadian Constitution. which was more conducive to sleep than counting sheep. And of course, eventually I'd get to Section 91, which is the section the federal politicians love, Section 91. That defines our powers. And I would eventually get to subsection 9 of Section 91, which said the federal government was responsible for buoys, beacons, lighthouses, and Sable Island. Now, so in the middle of the night, I would wonder, why Sable Island? Like, there are thousands of islands around Canada, and why Sable Island? Well, the reason is that Sable Island is a sliver of sand 160 kilometers off of Nova Scotia. It's a small island, just a few miles wide and I think 20 kilometers long, 20 miles long. But it has sandbars that stick away out beyond the edge. It's also at the point where the Labrador Current, the cold air from the Labrador Current, meets the warm air from the Gulf Stream, so it's in fog most of the time. And in the 19th century, when our Constitution was being put together, 1864, it was considered it was called the graveyard of the Atlantic. Over 350 ships cracked up on Sable Island. Thousands of lives lost on that one island, thousands of animals, and junk piled up on the shore from countless wrecks. And the delegates to the Confederation conferences from Nova Scotia insisted that if they were going to be part of the Confederation, the federal government should take responsibility for Sable Island and erect a lighthouse and a life-saving station on Sable Island, which they did. Well, that little part of the Constitution served to remind me that there are hazardous coastlines in our world today. The ethically hazardous coastlines, where politicians, businesses, professionals can shipwreck. The Enrons, the WorldComs, the Hollingers, the derivative traders, and on the political side, the sponsorship scandal punched a hole in the hull of our ship of state. Some of the current activities of senators might be put into this category as well. And I think being conscious of these ethical, hazardous places ethically in our society is an important thing. And there's a need to erect lighthouses at not every place where there's an ethical dilemma, but there's some places where we ought to make a specific effort to provide people with guidelines to avoid this kind of behavior, or you're going to get into trouble. You're going to get into trouble as an individual. You're going to wreck your company. You can wreck your political party, and you can wreck your government. And one of the I could get into a number of ethical dilemmas. There are places where I think we should erect ethical lighthouses, sort of the ethical equivalents of Sable Island. But one of the ethical dilemmas that I think we frequently encounter today, certainly in the political arena, is that of moral and ethical relativism. The idea that there are no standards that you can count on in these situations. That, I'll believe what I believe, you believe what you believe, and as long as we kind of respect each other, it's all going to work itself out. I don't think that is the case. I taught, for a couple of years, I taught a course on politics and the genetic revolution at the University of Toronto. You might say, what do you know about genetics? Well, not very much, but I would invite experts on these various subjects, and I would take notes along with the young people. But my challenge was to how does the developments of genetic science, what are the political ramifications of that? And of course, this is a field that's fraught with ethical and moral questions. The stem cells, cloning, therapeutic cloning, surrogacy, there's a whole nest of issues. So one day I asked these students to write on one page what was the ethical framework or the ethical values that they would bring to bear on these questions if they were asked to do it. These are fourth year, mainly half of them are political science and law students, half of them were from the life sciences. And this is what they came up with. There was 15 of them that did this seriously. Some of them didn't. But 5 of them said they would rely almost entirely on subjective criteria centered on themselves. I guess it comes down to me. What will the impact be on me? What will my parents and friends think about me? This was the ethical framework. Three of them applied a kind of a broader humanistic framework. What will be the ramifications of doing this or not doing that for others? And that included a sort of a version of the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm to others. Three of them took a utilitarian approach, saying, well, you just count up the pluses and the minuses, the costs and the benefits, and whatever course of action is the greatest good for the greatest number or the least harm, that's the one you go with. One was explicitly religious, relying for guidance on the character of a moral being beyond themselves and humankind, and a moral code based on that character. And three offered what I could only call creative mixtures, which defied categorization and told me that they didn't have the foggiest notion how to go about it. But this kind of thing illustrates to me, or suggests to me, that the prevalence of ethical relativism in the political arena raises this question: are there firmer ethical standards that I should move towards or adopt in order to engender trust in others? And I'm not a theologian or a philosopher, and so I probably get into hot water here, but I can share with you what, because like in politics, the tendency to, relativism is the easiest position to go to. You know, you go to this bunch, well, yeah, you think that, yeah, I kind of go along with that. Yeah. Green cheese, yeah, green cheese maybe. But these are two ethical guidelines that, for better or for worse, I personally have found helpful. And both drawn, in my case, from the Judeo-Christian tradition, although you find similar statements in other faith and humanist traditions. And the one is from the old Jewish law, love your neighbor as yourself. And the other is from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I value these ethical guidelines and think they're especially relevant to politicians in an adversarial situation, which we usually are, and to business people in a semi-capitalist system, because they have a peculiarly practical aspect that doesn't ignore or call on you to abandon your own self-interest, but invites you to use your own self-interest as a guide to recognizing and servicing the interests of others. The Jewish code didn't say just love your neighbor. Didn't stop there. It said love your neighbor as yourself. Understand, appreciate yourself and your own personal interest, and then offer that same understanding and appreciation to others. And in the Sermon on the Mount, he didn't just say do good to others. He said do unto others as you would have them do unto you. These are the guidelines that I have tried to practice and inculcate in others. And just as a politician, I would make it your goal to offer your constituents that same ethical standards of truthful communication, honest service, whatever, that you would demand if you were in their shoes. Communicate with them as you would be communicated with. You want to be communicated with truthfully, then communicate to them truthfully. Handle their money as you would have your money handled. Serve others as you would be served. Now, one last word in conclusion. Can the ethical few set the ethical standard for the many, for a government or for a business or a university? And let me close with an old but true Alberta story that combines politics, ethics, and faith. And this story actually occurred. I know both of the participants in it. And it occurred in 1947 after the discovery of oil at Leduc. You know, Alberta was flat on her back. Alberta was the one province that went bankrupt in the Depression. Couldn't borrow after 1938. Budget of the province of Alberta was $17 million in 1938. $9 million of it was debt service charges. You ran the province of Alberta on $7 million. And then Leduc came in. My father was premier at the time. They got a call from New York, from First Boston Corporation that was looking after the debt that they weren't paying the interest on, saying all is forgiven. All is forgiven. But as soon as Leduc hit, of course, every oil entrepreneur in North America showed up in Edmonton, mainly the oil patch people from the United States, from Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana. And they had two questions when they got to Edmonton. Where is Leduc, and who do you pay? Because in the American system, particularly in the early days in the oil patch, the way you got drilling rights was to pay off the political people. And there was a whole corruption that occurred in the oil patch in the United States that it was a dickens of thing to get out once you got it in. The federal administration of Warren G. Harding was brought down basically over an oil scandal in the oil patch. The bribe given to grant drilling rights in a federal nature reserve. So anyway, now my father was aware of the dangers to an oil-producing area on the ethical front if you ever had a boom. So he used to, at least once a year, round his troops up, the deputy ministers, the deputy ministers, the assistant deputies, and his cabinet and MLAs. And they would have called it a sermon, but he had this short thing: those of us who make the laws and those of us who administer the laws had better keep the laws or we lose our moral authority to govern. That was his. And he also hinted that I have a couple of guys in the Attorney General's department. He'd never say who they were because this created a mystery about it, who are going to be watching that we keep this rule. But you can only do so much by, preaching at people. It's not good enough. Anyway, the oil patch people went around, where's Leduc and who do we pay? And fortunately for Alberta, two of the people that they hit on first, one was a civil servant by the name of Hubert Somerville, who was a fairly lowly guy. By that time, Alberta didn't have an energy department. It had mines and minerals, and petroleum was quite low because Alberta didn't have oil except at Turner Valley. And Somerville was the civil servant who was in charge of petroleum and Somerville was one of the guys that they went to and said, do we got to pay you? Do we got to pay some people in the bureaucracy? Who do we got to pay to get the drilling rights? The other person they went to was a man named Orvis Kennedy, who was the president of the Alberta Social Credit League, the political party, the governing party's political organization, and its chief fundraiser. And of course, he was a natural target. They went to him. Well, Orvis, who do we got to pay? All these MLAs, the premier, what? And fortunately for Alberta, both these men, without consultation, I don't think they knew each other at that stage, both of them said exactly the same thing, and they said it instantly. They said, if you ever offer me or my people a bribe like that again, we will ensure one thing. We will use our influence to ensure one thing, that you and your company never get drilling rights in the province of Alberta. And of course, for the oil patch guys, that was fine. It's going to be cheaper doing business here than Louisiana. All they wanted to know was the rules. And Somerville actually began his work with the Alberta government in the Depression at $700 a year salary. And what these people were offering was an awful lot more than that. Somerville eventually became deputy minister of the department, retired with a fairly decent pension, but not by oil patch standards. Kennedy was even poorer than Somerville and never ended up with a pension at all. Died a poor man, but died with his integrity too. Somerville, if you asked him, and I did ask him once, like, why did you say that at the time that you did? And you didn't have a lot of time to think about it. He said it was my standards as a professional civil servant. It was my professional standard, and that's why I did it. Kennedy did it because of his faith commitment. Kennedy said, because I think in the end of the day I'm accountable to God, not just to your father or to the party or to whoever. So I guess what I'm saying here is that codes of ethics and ethics commissioners, regulatory and accountability legislation certainly have their place in raising the ethical tone of politics or business in the profession. But if the aim is ethical, corruption-free politics or business in the professions, people of personal integrity and character in the right place, at the right time, doing the right thing, there is no substitute for that. And I would say to some of the younger people here, like you may think you've got time to figure out your ethics, and I guess maybe you do, but you never know what position you may get into. Neither Somerville nor Kennedy were at the top of their organizations. They were kind of in the middle of them. And you never know when you're in a position where you doing the right thing or the wrong thing can have enormous ramifications for your country. Those two men saved Alberta hundreds of millions of dollars. Being the right person at the right time with the right ethical standards. So, politics, faith, and ethics, a smattering of each to stimulate your thinking, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.